Our final promising practice is on adopting innovation approaches to increase attainment in industry-recognized credentials. This will be presented by Angela Hanks, who is currently an Associate Director of the Workforce Development Policies on the Economic Policy Team at the Center of American Progress. In this role, her focus is innovative strategies to expand access to reduce cost of education and training that builds the skills of U.S. workers. Ms. Hanks' experience includes serving as Senior Federal Policies Analyst for National Skills Coalition, developing and advancing federal workforce policies. She holds a JD from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law and a bachelor's degree in political science from the George Washington University.
Hi, good morning. Oh, great. So I am here this morning to talk about innovative practices, and so most of the work that I do at the Center for American Progress is focusing primarily on federal policies to help promote education and training, but we also look at state policies as well and try to look at best practices on the ground to figure out what can be lifted up to the federal level. So to begin today, I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the universe of credentials as we're thinking about what does it mean for a credential to be industry recognized, and what does that mean for policies on the ground. So kind of in general, there's increasing recognition, I think, among policymakers and practitioners and among people who are just in the local labor markets that credentials are more and more of a requirement to get and keep a good paying job. For example, by 2020, approximately 2/3 of all jobs will require some education or training beyond high school. That's kind of significant, and really we're only a couple of years away from that, and I think there's probably agreement that we're not quite at a place where all people have access to that type of education and training. So we have this issue here where the demand for credentials is going up, but access hasn't necessarily risen to meet that demand. So there is certainly some movement on the credential front. So certificates that are below the associate's degree level, typically 1 to 2 year certificates, are now the fastest growing credential. However, I think one thing to keep in mind with certificates is, on the one hand, I think that indicates that there's a growing understanding that you don't need a 4-year degree. There are a lot of middle skill jobs where a certificate or an associate's degree is sufficient for middle class employment. But at the same time, certificates are really much different than associate's and bachelor's degrees. It's very important for certificates to be in field. So, if I get a certificate in welding and then I go work in a hospital, I'm not likely to see a wage premium from that certificate, but if I go on to work in welding, then I will. So certificates are really an important tool, but they really have to be targeted to the industry, and that means, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, that means working with employers, that means making sure that the certificates that you're offering are in demand, are the right certificates, they're teaching the right skills, and it's really critical because without it, it's really ultimately a piece of paper that doesn't really get you to that next step. So, so the validation piece is very important. So I do want to talk a little bit about, we just heard about some of the federal programs that support education and training, and I just want to run through a couple of the major ones really quickly. So obviously we just heard a bit about WIOA. So it replaces WIA, it reauthorizes the public workforce system, which includes the network of one-stop centers and the local boards that run them. WIOA offers training and job search and a whole host of other services to workers, as you just explained, and is really at the center of our workforce development efforts at the federal level. This is really the major program that, that I think we see as the primary source of funding for skills. There's also the Higher Education Act, which authorizes federal student loans and grants. So when people go to community colleges to get some sort of skills training. It may be paid through some sort of loan or grant program. Importantly, and I think this is a challenge for skills programs, is that federal loans and grants only support programs that are offered for academic credit, and many of the programs that teach workforce development are offered on the non-credit side of a college. So, you know, it's sort of this weird situation where you might be taking a program that is designed to lead directly to a job at a community college, but if it's not offered for academic credit, then you won't be able to get any financial assistance to participate in it. So, you know, that's, in my view, a challenge with the Higher Education Act, is we're not reaching nearly the number of people that we could because workforce programs are often left out of that funding source. So next we have the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. The Carl D. Perkins Act supports career and technical education efforts both at the secondary and post-secondary levels. And really, the purpose of this law is to build the capacity to support career and technical education programs. So, you know, it's really about building infrastructure around career and technical education. And then there are other more targeted programs that I won't get into all of them, but some of the highlights. There's the SNAP Employment and Training Program, which is run out of USDA, and that is essentially supports education and training for people who are recipients of the SNAP program, what was formerly food stamps. And this is a program that has been very tiny in the past, but was recently reauthorized, and the focus now on SNAP E&T is kind of moving from what used to be either kind of an underused and sometimes punitive program to something that really allows SNAP participants to help build their skills in a non-punitive way and move on to higher wage employment or into the labor market. There's also trade adjustment assistance. This is training and relocation and financial assistance for workers who have lost their jobs as a result of global trade. TAA is a relatively small program. I think last year about 50,000 people were served through trade adjustment, but it is a resource for communities that have been hit hard by manufacturing jobs moving away and things of that nature, and it is an important resource. And then there are also reentry programs. The Department of Labor supports reentry programs both for youth and adults and offers competitive grants for those funds. So those are kind of the major federal programs, but I want to move on to talk about what the best practices are and how to use those funding streams to help support those best practices. So the first best practice that I want to mention is sectoral training. So again, going back to the idea of employer demand, sectoral training programs are really a good way to ensure that the skills that workers are learning in their classrooms are the same skills that employers who are hiring in the community need. One example of sectoral training are sector partnerships. These are partnerships that bring together a range of stakeholders, starting with employers in a sector, but also education and training providers, a local workforce development board, community-based organizations, nonprofits, and you know, it could be a mix of these stakeholders, but those are generally who are involved. And potentially some intermediary that works to kind of facilitate this partnership. And really the purpose of a sector partnership is to bring together these stakeholders to identify what skills are needed and build training programs around them. So it's really a helpful way to leverage employer capacity in a local area. These are developed at the local and regional levels. So, you know, this is something that's really helpful if you have a cluster of manufacturers in one area and, you know, one shop might have 25 workers. So they might not start a training program if they're only hiring one person a year. Like, that doesn't make financial sense. But if the 10 manufacturers that are in their area are hiring for the same type of job and they're all going to hire one or two people that year, then it starts to make sense to work together and leverage your resources to develop a program that can work for all of you. At my last job, one of the manufacturers we worked with used to call his fellow manufacturers in his partnership, his co-opetition. So even though they were working, they were competing day to day, it was in their collective best interest to work together to build this partnership to make sure that they had workers. Then I think more broadly on sectoral training, while the sector partnerships are one model, there's also kind of the one-for-one model where training programs are working directly with employers. So there was a study that just came out in August of this year that found that it studied 4 programs that were sectoral training programs, 2 in New York, 1 in Oklahoma, and 1 in Ohio. And the study found that not only did these programs increase earnings, they also increased retention, they increased credential acquisition, and they increased employment in the sector, which again is really critical for these shorter-term workforce development programs. So that's where you get those earnings gains, is when people are employed in sector. And again, partnerships with employers are essential to this model. It's really critical not only that employers are engaged, in a kind of direct way, but it also has to be like a deep relationship with these employers. It can't just be going to get them to sign off, or them just showing up to 1 or 2 meetings and then coming back to you if they're disappointed with the training. Like that's not really how this works. This really should be a true partnership where all parties are working together to get to the same goal. So some other best practices. So apprenticeship is one. This is something that's been getting, I would say, a lot of attention, both in the states and at the federal level. Center for American Progress has done a lot of work trying to lift up apprenticeships and trying to advocate for and develop policies to ensure that they're supported at the local level. Apprenticeships are great because they're this earn and learn strategy where you're earning a wage, you have a job, you're employed, and you really get this intensive training over the course of years. And eventually, the wages for an apprenticeship, the average wage is $50,000 a year. So these are not low-wage jobs. These are pretty, solidly middle-class jobs. The challenge is, there are a few challenges, but part of the challenge is that there are very few apprenticeships in the US, and this kind of renewed attention to apprenticeships is relatively new. President Obama set a goal of doubling and diversifying the number of apprenticeships by 2019, about 2 years ago. So we're 2 years into the Department of Labor working to meet that goal, and we've been really engaged on the policy level, trying to make sure that the Department of Labor and states have adequate support to meet that goal, but we're still very early on in that. And then the final one I'll mention is career pathways. So career pathways are a sequence of portable and stackable credentials designed to meet learners where they are. Some of the key features of a career pathway, they have multiple on and off ramps, again, going back to that theme of meeting folks where they are. And they often offer wraparound services. So they're really critical if you can't get to training or can't get to work because you can't access childcare, or you don't know how to procure childcare assistance or transportation assistance. Having that support can help you persist along that pathway. So I started to talk a little bit about the barriers with apprenticeship, but I think in general, there's this big barrier to promoting best practices in that there is very little money at the federal level to support innovation. So like for instance, career pathways and sector partnerships are required activities under WIOA. The law passed with $0 new to support those important activities. So you can imagine, I'm sure for those of you who sit on local workforce boards, it's kind of frustrating when you hear, oh, you have to do this, you have to develop this new program, you have to go out and reach out to all of these new partners, you have to access employers who are reluctant to work with the system, and by the way, you have to do it for free. That is a tough pill to swallow. So, I think in general that access to funding for innovative models is something that's a real challenge. The Department of Labor has tried to get around that. They have a little bit of money for discretionary grants. Last year they awarded I think about $150 million in sector partnership grants through the National Emergency Fund that they administer, but it's really kind of like picking up money wherever it is instead of having some dedicated funding to support innovation. And now, particularly like I mentioned with sector partnerships, we now have, this really rigorous research that says this is an effective way to provide training, and then we still don't have any federal policy support to really make sure that we can develop these practices. But then in addition to funding kind of overall, there's also, the lingering stigma of the old vocational model. I think this is something that's really, in particular, a challenge for young people and parents to get over, what they think of as kind of dirty jobs, whereas, many jobs that are middle skills, you're working in a hospital or on a manufacturing floor with very advanced and expensive equipment. I think that's something that hasn't really gotten out there to many young people and parents, and so to the extent that it's possible to kind of increase access to better information on that is a positive thing. There's also kind of an inadequate and fragmented policy infrastructure. So like I mentioned, we have those, a couple of different laws that authorize different types of investments in workforce. However, we're kind of just starting to get to the point where at the federal level, federal policymakers are not only making it easier for those programs to interact together, but also are really kind of encouraging those programs to interact together on the ground. So for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the law allowed states to develop plans where they brought in some of these other programs in an area, so career and technical education, the TANF system, the SNAP system, and kind of these other programs that have components of workforce development, but not only have components of workforce development, but also touch on the range of supportive services that people need in order to persist. So, I think that's been a challenge, and it's something there's some initial progress that's occurring, but certainly there's a long way to go on that because we have that in WIOA, but next, the Carl G. Perkins Act is up for reauthorization right now, and the House and Senate have been working on that. So it's critical that as they're working on that law, that they're thinking about common performance measures, thinking about kind of institutionalizing partnerships with the workforce development system, and making it easier for those programs to interact on the ground. There's also, again, this limited funding issue. So in addition to not very much funding for innovation, the programs that I mentioned also struggle with getting sufficient funding. So, this is a factor of a number of things, but what I would point to first and foremost is kind of the austerity environment that we've been in Washington over the past several years. WIOA authorized funding at certain levels. It hasn't been funded at those levels for the past 2 years. The funding has been lower than what Congress said it should be. And so not only has it been challenging to get funding that these programs should have, but then new funding has been very scarce as well. So again, it's hard to kind of develop and expand these best practices when funding is actually in some cases going down for these programs. And then another is just a lack of access to supportive services. And then finally, kind of because of all of these things, you can say that best practices really haven't been fully implemented. Again, we have some things that we know that work, but at least on the federal level, it's been very difficult to try to scale those best practices. So some of the policy priorities that CAP is really interested in, again, like I said, we've done a lot of work to expand apprenticeships. Some of the things that we're looking at is expanding apprenticeship into new industries. So as I'm sure many of you know, apprenticeship has typically been concentrated in the building and construction trades, which has, had a long tradition of kind of developing this model, but if we're going to really use apprenticeship as a model for a lot of workers across the country, it can't just be in building. The growth can't just be in the building and construction trades. So, thinking about moving apprenticeship into healthcare and IT and advanced manufacturing, and there's actually a new pilot program in Chicago piloting health apprenticeships in the insurance industry. Like this earn and learn model is something that could be extrapolated to a number of different industries, but that work is ongoing. The second one is strengthening diversity and inclusion efforts. Another challenge with apprenticeship is that they're concentrated in the building construction trades, and they don't typically include women or people of color, or haven't historically, so that is a problem. So for instance, of the apprentices, there are more than 50% of the apprenticeships are in the building and construction trades. Only 2.3% of those jobs are held by women. For women and for people of color, the apprenticeships that they tend to be in tend to be the lower wage apprenticeships. So even if you do get into an apprenticeship, it's probably on the lower end of the pay scale. So there are some issues there with diversity and inclusion, and there's some things that we've already weighed in with the Department of Labor on, and this has been a priority, I know, for Secretary Perez and the folks who are running his office. But certainly it's a challenge, and it's something we have to continue to think about as we're thinking about expansion, because if the whole purpose of this is to expand opportunity to high-wage jobs, we can't leave out a significant sector of the population, segment of the population from those efforts. And then finally, we've also focused on providing federal and state level support. So at the federal level, I saw you're fortunate to have Congresswoman Wilson here tomorrow, and I'm sure she'll talk more about her bill, the LEAP Act, which is also introduced by Senator Booker and Senator Scott in the Senate, which would provide a federal employer tax credit to support apprenticeship. But that is mimicking efforts done at the state level, offering those tax credits. South Carolina has had a lot of success with their Apprenticeship Carolina model, and one big part of that is this $1,000 tax credit that they offer to employers. So that's certainly something that can help. And the states have a number of different models that I hope will help inform federal policy and that we've written about at CAP. The other thing that we have really done some work on is facilitating partnerships between community colleges and industry. And I would actually even expand that to include other providers of training. Community colleges are a big provider of training. They are not the only one. So facilitating industry partnerships, no matter where those training programs are housed, is important. And then finally, we have proposals to expand subsidized employment and national service as a workforce and development strategy. So some policy changes that are needed. So in WIOA, there is this language requiring sector partnerships. It does promote apprenticeship as well. The challenge there is just implementation and making sure that these best practices can be implemented. For HEA, the Higher Education Act, I would say, again, that the biggest thing is probably making sure that that law works for people who are seeking some sort of occupational training, making sure they have access to federal student aid, so they're not going to complete this program that's going to result in a job and going to college and not getting any student aid for it. And then through HEA, there could be better support for partnerships between community colleges and employers. For Perkins, some of our priorities include access to better work-based learning and more opportunities for work-based learning. One reason why the apprenticeship model is so good is that there's evidence out there that work-based learning is really kind of a very efficient and effective way to make sure that people learn and retain the skills that they're seeking. So expanding access to work-based learning, both for people who are engaging in career and technical education programs at the secondary level and at the post-secondary level, is a priority. And then finally, funding is a constant problem, and that's something that we continue to advocate for on a number of programs. CAP works across a number of areas, from higher education to energy and everything in between. So funding has always been a challenge. Funding has been a challenge in a lot of areas for the past several years, but this seems like we're in a moment where there are policymakers on both sides of the aisle talking about how skills development is so important. And so it's really important to hold them accountable and say, okay, you think this is important, you think this is a priority, you gotta give us some money to do this work. I think you'll have some good advocates here tomorrow that share that feeling and can help advance that work on the Hill. And then finally, looking ahead to 2017, no matter what happens on November 8th, we will have a new administration come January. And a new administration means new opportunities. Regardless of who the president is, a new administration is going to want to have a set of policy priorities and be able to hit the ground running on day one. A lot of the major policy endeavors that a new administration undertakes happens in that first 100 days. So I think the biggest thing is just being ready to go and making sure that they have workforce as a priority as they're thinking about what their first 100 days agenda looks like. I will say there's one candidate that might be more receptive to policy development in this area, but I think that regardless, this is a priority, and I think that, again, this is something that's bipartisan. And then, I also think it's important to safeguard the progress that's already been made. We've been really fortunate over the past several years that the Obama administration has really lifted up workforce and skills development. Secretary Perez, I feel like, has been everywhere in the past several years. And really, this has been something that when you have the vice president taking on a big skills agenda and conducting a review of job training programs, the president talking about apprenticeships in the State of the Union. I mean, this is something that just hasn't happened for workforce ever. So, they've made a lot of good progress, and I think it's important to continue to build on that and make sure that some of the programs that they've kind of gone out on their own without Congress on, using the discretionary money that they have, that those programs stay once the administration leaves. And then just kind of in general, one of the things that we've been thinking about a little bit in terms of that 100 days window, something that I think probably both candidates would be interested in is infrastructure. And so I think that there's probably an opportunity to think about how do you use infrastructure as a way to advance a jobs agenda as well. So that is something that we're starting to work on. I know that a number of other policy groups who focus on policies to help low-wage workers are thinking about as well, and that's something that'll continue to be a priority for us over the next few months. And then final word, advocacy is needed for all of these programs. I don't think we're nearly where we are, but we're better off than we were on the policy front a couple of years ago. There's more attention, there's more bipartisanship on skills, but it really is about continued advocacy, because without that, policymakers will just move on to the next flavor of the month, and this is really something that's important for workers, for our economy, and for making sure that low-wage workers can move into the middle class. So that's it for me. I'm happy to answer questions. Yep.
Thank you. Good morning. Ruben Blackwell, Rocky Mount OIC. I noticed and thank you for a great presentation. I noticed that you said that your organization supports campaign support. And can you talk a little bit about what that means? And is there, part two of that question, is there any type of national movement underway through all the workforce development providers to come together to advocate in the political arena for the platforms and the agendas that we need?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, across the organization, we do a lot of coalition work with different organizations. Like on this infrastructure piece, we're actually working in cooperation with a number of anti-poverty groups. So there are always, kind of there's always coalition work that we're doing around kind of specific issue-based work. And then on the kind of generally, on an ongoing basis, I'll actually give a plug for my former employer who does the National Skills Coalition, because they do a lot of grassroots organizing and advocacy around skills. And so to be honest, our model doesn't necessarily allow for me to do a lot of on-the-ground work just because I'm one of one in our workforce development department. But we do a lot of work with organizations like that that are able to reach out into communities.
Good morning, thank you.
Morning.
We really appreciate your kind of 40,000-foot level view, but I'd like to bring it down a little bit more local, if that's okay. One of it, financial aid. I represent the technical colleges here in South Florida, or in Broward County, and I would say that about 75% of our students are on some sort of financial aid, including Pell. So please don't take away the notion that students are not eligible for financial aid because they're coming to technical programs.
Oh,
they most certainly are. As I said, about 75% of our students are Pell eligible. The program does have to be 600 hours in clock hours or more, so that there are certainly some that are not eligible, but a vast majority are. I also wanted to give a plug for our apprenticeship programs here in South Florida. Atlantic Technical College coordinates the largest apprenticeship programs in the state of Florida. We have anywhere about 20 different apprenticeship programs. Yes, they are mostly connected to construction and probably mostly male. But we also are very, very responsive to our business community. The South Florida Manufacturers Association, much like your example, came together and realized that they needed to grow their own, and so we worked with them to create a machining apprenticeship, and that's grown and is very, very active. Also, we are very much partnership with our business community. As a part of our accrediting requirements, I know that the community colleges, or the Broward College and the state colleges, as well as the technical colleges, all require advisory councils, so there is a constant conversation with our business and industry community to make sure that we are training what they want. Thank you.
That's great to hear. Thanks. And thank you for clarifying on the credit piece. I kind of oversimplified that a little bit, so I appreciate that.
Yes. Thank you again for coming.
Oh.
I know I'm short, but I didn't think I'd ask you. Thank you again for coming, and I appreciate the presentation that you've made. I have a question. It may be a twofold question, not sure, but it piggybacks on the apprenticeship that she spoke about. I know in North Carolina, they have been targeting apprenticeships, but they're targeting high schools. And so when it comes to the adult worker or the dislocated worker, those apprenticeship programs are not necessarily available to them, or it hasn't actually been initiated yet. So my question is, do you see a connection between the lack of those apprenticeship programs, particularly in North Carolina, as it relates to the lack of unions? Because I notice when we go to national meetings that the unions already have in place their apprenticeship programs. It is not necessarily targeted towards high school students, and it's anybody. So I'm wondering, what is the process moving forward to make sure that adult dislocated workers, or adults in general, are able to participate in apprenticeship programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. So I know, North Carolina has focused a lot on building that high school pipeline, and that was in part because the companies that have been leading that effort are mostly German companies, and so like the German model, you start when you're in high school or when you're a teenager. That said, in the US, like the average starting age for an apprenticeship is 28. So we're not nearly at that level. I agree. I think there should be opportunities at no matter what your age level is. And I certainly think it would be a missed opportunity if we focused only on high school students, because there are a lot of people in the workforce who would benefit from this. So, you know, while I would say, like, you kind of need a both-and strategy, because, you know, sometimes when I think about the fact that the average age is 28, I kind of wonder, like, what are those people doing from when they graduate high school until they're 28? You know, should they be able to access this opportunity earlier? But at the same time, you know, there are plenty of people who have already passed the high school age. So, you know, I think that probably the best thing that we can do is do a both-and strategy and have programs that start in high schools, but also have programs that aren't affiliated with high schools and accept workers of all ages. And then also, we just need to do a better job making workers aware that these programs exist. Because I think that part of the problem why you don't find out until you're 28 is because a lot of the ways that people find out about these programs are word of mouth. And so you find out that your friend, has this great job and they've been doing it for a couple of years, and so that can't be the primary way that people find an apprenticeship, is because their friend had it and thought it was great. Like they should know about it well before then. So I think there's just better information and then a better diversity in programming. And some of that also means that like policies need to target, they can't just target high schools.
Again, Reverend Holston, National President of OIC of America. Thank you, Angela, for being here and accepting our invitation and for coming. Something we shared together, I wanted to kind of elaborate on again, and just to get your thoughts on. In the 1970s, if we had it in real dollars today, our budget would have been about $17 billion for workforce development, particularly for disadvantaged people. Today, for disadvantaged people, even though overall workforce development budget may be $8 billion, it's really about $3 billion for disadvantaged people. That's a great disparity in our federal funding levels. First of all, are the legislators really aware of the great disparity between what was done in the 70s compared to what was done today? And if so, what is their answer to that, since during those times poverty did go down based on that kind of investment? So.
If I'm being honest, I would actually guess that they are probably not aware, aware of that disparity, just because, that requires probably a long tenure and a long, a lengthy, institutional knowledge, which is tough to find. But again, I go back to, funding was insufficient before 2010, but really, starting in 2010, it just got nearly impossible to get a single extra dollar. And so, one of the things that I've used to message to policymakers is that, we lost 30% of our funding from 2001 to 2010. That's a short period of time, and that's significant.
Yes.
And I think that did help. Part of the challenge is that up until WIO was reauthorized, there wasn't a whole lot of political support around WIA. I think that the general thought among policymakers, probably on both sides of the aisle, is that it wasn't particularly effective. Whether or not that's true is another story, but I do think that is something that was kind of a prevalent mindset. So now we have this new law. I think that there is a new opportunity. We're finally at full implementation. I don't think we're going to get back to $17 billion under WIOA, but I do think that there's a better argument now for, as we're thinking about, updating all of these systems, whether it's WIOA, whether it's CTE, whether it's HEA, or whether it's other efforts to help dislocated workers, like the Obama administration has proposed new funding just for dislocated workers. So there are probably other opportunities. I don't know if WIOA is the vehicle, but I do think that we have a much stronger argument as Congress continues to reauthorize these workforce laws. Because now it's okay, so you've strengthened these programs, now it's time to fund them at the levels that they should be funded at.
Thank you so much.
Good morning. Lisa Perez, HBL Resources, HR consultant of 5 years, HR practitioner of 25. My question, I have to sharpen the saw a little bit on my earlier question regarding soft skills training, and particularly as it relates to taking that line worker and making them a manager. And I think there's a disconnect between the two. We can make good widgets, but we don't know how to manage people. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is a series that I've titled Complete Manager Makeover, and it gives the potential line manager, but sometimes experienced managers, those skills and tools in terms of when you walk into that conversation, how do you have the conversation? What do you say? And not just the laws that you have to be aware of. So with that said, you talk about certifications and certificates and things of that nature. One of the things that I've done is go to the HRCI, Human Resource Certification Institute, and get that series credited from them. Are there any other things that you think I should be doing to make sure that employers see this as valid for their workforce and the individuals as well, to see that it's something that will give them some additional skills?
So I don't know if I have a great answer to your question, but I can say some of the work that we've been doing on employer-provided training, because I think one of the challenges that we have seen is that employers just aren't training their workers as much. So we put out a paper over the summer that certainly does not solve this problem, but it was kind of noting that from 2001 to 2009, the incidence of employer-provided training went down by almost 30%, which is a massive disinvestment in workers. And our solution in that paper was requiring publicly traded companies to report on their human capital investments the way they do in research and development, as a way to like incentivize, because right now it's like basically lumped in with like general waste on a balance sheet. And so, you know, it's a way for employers to kind of get credit for making investments. That's certainly not the only way, but I think that that's not the only way to increase those investments, because obviously the majority of companies in this country are privately held. But, you know, I think it's just kind of one way that we're starting to think about that. But we do want to continue to push on that. It's one reason why we've been pushing apprenticeship too. But of course, like, learning doesn't happen once. It happens over and over throughout your career, and I think there's more recognition of that. So we're going to keep pushing to try to see if we can incentivize further training in-house, or as you're moving along in your employment with an employer. You know, it is a challenge because, frankly, like, the nature of work has changed so much that in some cases there might not be any opportunities for advancement, or, you know, employers might be hesitant to invest because they think people are going to leave. And so part of that is also changing the mindset around the investment that you're getting from training people that already work for you. So the study was done by Jeffrey Waddups at UNLV, and our paper is called Workers or Waste.
Good morning, or good afternoon. No, it's still morning. I'm Dr. Irish Spencer, Welfare Reform Liaison Project. I call it WRLP. I got a twofold kind of question, or maybe a comment, regarding community colleges, apprenticeships. In North Carolina, where we are, we have a lot of schools. One community college in particular, if a person is attending the school and for whatever reason had to leave and owed any money in the bookstore and they wanted to go back, until that bill was cleared up, they were unable to go back. Because our federal funding will not allow for us to clear up their bill for them to go back to school, what we did is, I'm a social enterprise fanatic, so I decided to start another social enterprise, and that money pays to clear up those bills. Then I decided, okay, sometimes community colleges will work with you, sometimes they will not. And for those that will not, then we just start the program ourselves and hire their professors away from them to come work for me. So I guess what I'm saying is, it would be great if it was some type of mechanism or funding other than me having to sit and say, what social enterprise? And I don't have a problem with that, because that's what I do well. But what is it, can we work together for something as simple as a mother that had to drop out of school to have a baby, and she left a $20 bill in the bookstore, and she wants to go back to get that CNA, and she cannot because she owes $20 that she doesn't have to pay it, and I can't give it to her from federal funds. But there's got to be a better way, and it may be great in Florida, but in North Carolina, if you owe a community college $1, you can't go back until you clear that up. Thank you. Comment or question?
Yeah.
Whichever way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I don't even know what time it is. Denise Ash, I'm the director at the Montgomery County OIC in Pennsylvania, and we just completed an apprenticeship program with the unions, building trades, which was very interesting because we kept getting phone calls from people over that 24 years old, but we couldn't serve them. And the problem that the unions were having is not that the people couldn't get in, because they do take it with a record, but they couldn't pass the test. So we were like putting them through the soft skills, as you say, to do that. But also they had other skills and barriers, because if they came out of the prison system or were in a certain population of barriers, they didn't know how to even deal with the simple fact on how to get to work. What do I need to do to make, arrangements if I got to train at this site and go over to another site without transportation? So we were like their case managers or their voice, and calling them up. They call us at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm stuck here, I'm supposed to be somewhere in the morning. We found that that type of funding has gone down a lot to do that case management piece of that job in order to get them to the next step. So we're like doing that without funding, because we can't use the funds for that. We need to let someone know that the people that we're putting into these apprenticeship programs, the union needs them because they have a severe shortage of programs. But they also need to realize that these students need more than just test training. So we got a partnership with our Chester County OIC to do some of that stuff so that we can train them in those other areas. But the pride of the students coming out when they finish and they graduate and they go through that union test is unbelievable, because they make a lot of money when they're done. They don't have any tuition payments like the colleges. They go through like a 2-3 year union training, and they come out with a job that's paying them $65,000 a year. So what we did find out from the colleges was that we're getting some credit hours for the math portion of the students, but the unions will give them a buy if they don't have a lot of people in that particular area that are union trained. They can go into the union without taking a lot of that testing, as long as they write a letter to the union in order to get in. So there's some things that you can do to do that. But speaking of rest care out in Greensboro, rest care was hired by our community to do case management, and basically they don't know how to do that. So we have an issue with rest care right now that we're working with, because they want us to train in this pocket, but they want rest care to send us to people, want us to train, give them back to rest care so they can place them, but our students don't feel comfortable with them. So we're running into this issue where we're wasting our time, but they don't want to pay us to continue the service. But this company, I don't know about North Carolina, but you can't give some of our students to a company who they don't see as having them, their interests in hand. They look at this rest care as a corporation that's just getting paid. So, so I don't feel comfortable releasing our works of art, our students, to a company that doesn't have their best interests. I mean, they're not doing what OICs can do. So we need to talk about some of these companies that are getting this funding instead of OICs.
So on your first point, I think I don't have a perfect solution, but it did occur to me that as we're thinking about expanding apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeship is a good on-ramp, and pre-apprenticeships, particularly that are tied and lead into apprenticeship programs, or that you can be eligible to apply to an apprenticeship program after you've completed, are a good resource, because then you learn some of those employability skills, kind of like the showing up to work on time, but also like some basic math and whatnot, depending on the program. And then the second thing is, especially if you're working with people who are returning citizens. So DOL, like a couple of weeks ago, just awarded these new industry and equity intermediary contracts. And so there's like 6 organizations that have these equity contracts. And so I know that for at least one, returning citizens is part of like who they're intended to help. And basically the entire purpose of those contracts is the contractor is supposed to provide technical assistance and resources for programs that are working with special populations. They just got the awards a month ago, so they're probably not up and running yet. But I do think that ultimately that's something that could be really helpful, because they can kind of like aggregate best practices across the country and then provide some both kind of like 40,000 foot assistance and some hands-on assistance on the ground as well, but that will to be determined. And then on the funding piece, we can talk about that more, but I think that that's probably a longer and tougher discussion. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about it further. Okay, so thank you so much, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Angela, for your presentation and all our presenters today.